Live. Hello and welcome to the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism's first event of Hillary term, Trumpism and American Conservatism. What's next? Today we will be discussing a wide range of topics, from the rise of Trumpism and populism, the lasting effect it has had and will have on American institutions and ideology, and the future of liberalism and conservatism in America. We'll be in discussion today for around 45 to 50 minutes, leaving open about 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end, where you can use the raise hand option. I'll be able to unmute you and you can pose questions directly to our guests. Professor Iwan Morgan is Emeritus Professor of United States History at the Institute of Americas, part of University College London, and recognized as one of the most respected scholars on American history in the United Kingdom. His work has focused on American political history and on political economy, with a direct focus on presidential history. He's written many biographies of presidents, including a biography of Reagan that was named the Times Book of the Year in 2016. Cathy Young is a Russian-born American journalist who has written extensively in her career on conservatism and feminism. Currently, Cathy is a regular columnist for Newsday, Reason, RealCLearPolitics, the Bulwark Online, and she's vice president of the Women's Freedom Network. She's worked freelance for almost all of the major American newspapers. Finally, Professor Nathan Tarcov is Professor of Social Thought and Political Science at the University of Chicago. Professor Tarcov specializes in the history of political theory and principles of foreign policy and is director of the Leo Strauss Center. Professor Tarcov has taught the history and evolution of political thought for 43 years at the University of Chicago, where he was recognized for excellence in undergraduate teaching in 1997. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for attending what we hope will be an enlightening discussion. And I'd like to start by asking you to give some general thoughts about the topic, particularly about what you think we talk about when we talk about Trumpism. Professor Tarcov, would you like to kick us off?
Well, I think there isn't much of an ism to it. It's very much a cult of personality. It's Trump more than ism. His appeal is a deep, compelling, emotional one to people mostly from the white working class who feel they've been left behind by immigration, globalization, automation, shift away from fossil fuels, policies that give preference to minority groups, and they resent the elite that they feel not only allowed this to happen, but despises them. It's partly a question of respect. And Trump somehow, surprisingly, as a New York real estate billionaire, figured this out and knew how to appeal to it. And other Republicans and many Democrats have not figured it out.
Thank you very much. Cathy, would you like to give your thoughts on this topic?
Right. Well, I agree with much of what Professor Tarcov said. I think it is very clear that Trumpism really is, as the professor said, a cult of personality, very in a very sort of essential way. But I do think that there is an ideology that's sort of partly underlying it and partly is kind of tailored to it. I think it is a kind of populism in the classic sense of the people versus the elites. It obviously does appeal to all these resentments that Professor Tarcov talks about. It constructs this, first of all, there's the appeal to a kind of mythic past. Make America Great Again is obviously the slogan. And it's also an appeal to, again, a kind of mythic unity of the good people, the real Americans, standing against all the sort of alien elements, whether it's illegal immigrants or sort of the enemy, Muslims, Muslim radicals. And of course the elites, that's really, again, the people versus the elites is the kind of paradigmatic opposition. And yes, of course, it is deeply ironic that Donald Trump is a New York real estate billionaire, but I think in a sense there is almost a kind of paradigm in which, he is someone who is in a sense of the elites, but has taken the side of the people. So I think that almost enhances his aura in the eyes of his followers as this sort of legendary hero. So yeah, I think that's essentially the ideology. I will say, by the way, one thing that's interesting, and we'll probably talk about that later, but despite, I certainly agree that the main base of Trumpism is the white working class, but apparently between the first and the second election that he was in, he actually was able to capture a larger share of minority voters. So that's a kind of interesting phenomenon. And I think there is this message of unity that certainly does appeal to a number of people across the board. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at.
Professor Morgan, what do you think?
Yes, I'd agree with most of what's been said. I don't see Trumpism as a coherent ideology. There are elements in it, but I don't think Trump's the kind of leader that really delves deep into ideas in the way that, shall we say, Ronald Reagan did back in the 1980s as a conservative Republican. I think, however, that Trumpism took on a particular identity that became much clearer in the run-up to the 2020 election, and particularly in the aftermath, where he displayed a very authoritarian element that had been present before in his presidency. And of course, the authoritarians spread the big lie. The big lie began with the false news attacks on the media. But then the big lie became that the election itself was flawed. The election itself was stolen. And I think there is a danger that Trump's legacy will be an anti-democratic development, and the development of an anti-democratic thrust to American politics for the remainder of the 2020s. And what's happening in the impeachment trial, which begins today, suggests that the Republicans are not going to cut themselves loose from him.
That's very interesting. If I can just pick up on one thing that you said there. You think that Donald Trump's legacy is mostly one of style as opposed to policy. If I could ask the other panelists, how far do you think this is true? Do you think Donald Trump represents some sort of inflection point in the style of American politics?
Do you want me to tackle this?
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, the thing that's interesting is that in many ways, Trump and what he represents is really the culmination of trends that have been, evolving in the Republican Party for some time. And sort of more generally in American politics, the tendency toward polarization, the tendency toward treating the other party as the enemy, the sort of the tendency to pit sort of real Americans against those who are spiritually alien elements, and the elites once again, and people with presumably un-American views. I think Sarah Palin represented at one point a lot of these tendencies, but she kind of ended up going nowhere after 2008. And at one point, it's kind of interesting to remember that she was being groomed as this sort of populist hero. So I think in a way, it's something that's been developing for a while. I think it is a new inflection point in the sense that it really brought those tendencies not only out into the open in a big way, but really kind of brought them to the fore. And I think the authoritarian element, it's interesting because, for 4 years, there was a lot of discussion of, is Trump an authoritarian leader or not? And, is he somebody who is undermining democracy? And there have been a lot of polemics about that. And then it actually took Trump losing the election for him to demonstrate for, I think really pretty clearly for, anyone who is not in complete denial that yes, there really is a major authoritarian element to his leadership, such as it is. And that, he really is appealing to profoundly illiberal and undemocratic forces. And essentially, it all ended in a very blatant attempt to steal an election, under the guise of preventing an election from being stolen. But that's sort of the big lie technique, obviously. So yeah, I think it certainly is a very troubling new level of authoritarianism, a new level of rejection of democracy. So yeah, I think that's very true.
So I want to zoom in on that a little, if I might. You say that Trump represents the culmination of a trend. Professor Tarcov, what do you think the weaknesses are in the mainstream of American ideology that allows that kind of tendency in? Because it was evident previously, but only on the fringes. So what do you think the tipping point was towards Trumpism becoming mainstream?
Well, it's always tempting in retrospect to see very surprising things that none of us predicted as the inevitable culmination of things before. But I certainly didn't expect Trump. So I hesitate to retrospectively create a narrative in which he was inevitable. And he was aided by fairly quite contingent events. The 2016 Republican race, you had one Trump and 15, quote, establishment candidates. The first primaries he was able to win was 25, 30% of the vote. And later ones he could win with 40%, and the so-called establishment candidates divided it up. If that was good luck for him to have, I'm teaching Machiavelli this quarter, to have divided enemies is a great advantage, right? And ones that refuse to coalesce. You had Cruz spending money in Florida, attacking Rubio and Bush. It was, and Trump won. Contrast this with what happened this season in the Democrats, where you had one socialist candidate who had not affiliated with the party, who had a reasonable chance of winning, and 15 regular Democrats, I'll say. And then when it looked like Bernie could actually win, they all withdrew and endorsed Biden, the exact opposite of what the Republicans did against Trump. So he's had the good luck of foolish efforts on the amongst his opponents, and that wasn't predictable or essentially inevitable. As Cathy said, Sarah Palin went nowhere. Trump could have gone nowhere, but he won.
Do you think it's fair to describe that as an institutional failure, or was it something else? Was it just bad luck? Was it a consequence of malformed institutions? What do you think it was?
Well, our parties have weakened. Both parties have weakened. The fact that Trump and Sanders, people who are not Republican, a Republican and not a Democrat, could win or almost win the presidential nomination is a sign that the parties are just much weaker. There's really nobody in charge. The change to having all the delegates by primary, or almost all the delegates by primaries, and the just general decline of the parties also on the local level too. This does reflect but it was also just a selfishness and short-sightedness on the part of his Republican opponents, or failure to take him seriously, maybe too. And the parties have changed. When I was young, the two parties overlapped. In New York and New England, you had liberal Republicans. In the South, you had conservative segregationist Democrats. Those categories don't exist. There are no liberal Republicans. There are almost no conservative Democrats. The parties don't overlap. They're much more polarized.
Well, there's Susan Collins still. So
Yeah.
Okay,
a couple of other,
and there's Joe Manchin on the other side. So
Yeah.
there's one
right.
Professor Morgan, I saw you
Yeah.
nodding. Would you like to
Yeah,
say something
I think
about
that's a very important point. What's happened, which Trump didn't create this, but he certainly exploited it. There have been sort of two parallel developments. Firstly, there's been a great sorting in the parties, as we've heard from Professor Tarcov. The Democrats wiped out the liberal and moderate Republicans, and once you had the civil rights revolution in the South, that gave the entree to the Republicans, once a party of Lincoln, to replace the Democrats as the protectors of the white South, so to speak. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that go back to the middle of the 20th century, landslide presidential elections were not a rarity. In fact, they were more frequent than very narrow ones. The only narrow elections that I can think of would be 1960, 1976, but narrow elections are now the norm. The parties are much more balanced, and what that means is the parties win by mobilizing their base. In the past, parties would reach out to some kind of moderate, non-strong identifiers, but now it's base mobilization, and that means playing the politics of polarization. And Trump did it brilliantly in 2016, not so brilliantly in 2020.
Why do you think that was? And anyone can answer this. Why did the winning formula for Donald Trump in 2016 not equate to another win in 2016? Why did the coalition fall apart? Cathy?
It didn't fall apart so much. I mean, look, 2020, we're talking about a COVID-19 election, an economy tanking. If Trump had won, it would have been one of the great political miracles of all time. The fact that he came so close is worrying. But you know, presidents run on their records in the second term. You can't be an opposition, much as you want to be. You can't be an opposition president when you're running for re-election.
Trump did hold his coalition together. He got 75 million votes, more votes than any presidential candidate had ever gotten before, but fewer than Biden.
Right.
His support did not decline, it grew. He mobilized people who hadn't voted 4 years before. It was quite remarkable. And it was very, very close. If you look at his margin in those crucial swing states that he surprisingly lost the next day, it was even smaller than the tiny margin Biden had in the swing states that, it was even smaller. The Biden's margin of victory in Michigan, Wisconsin, et cetera, was even smaller than Trump's in 2016. It was very, very close. That's why he claims that it was stolen. So I think it's a mistake to think that there was a substantial decline. Indeed, as Iwan says, it's remarkable that he did this well, given the circumstances. And he had this great advantage in 2016. He was running against Hillary Clinton. Unfortunately for him, he was not this time.
Yeah, if I may interject here, I think it's very true that the coalition didn't exactly fall apart. And certainly, Trump didn't collapse in the 2020 election. If he had, obviously, we would not have had this protracted dispute over who won the election. Not that there was a real dispute by the end, but even so, it was in many ways really quite close, worryingly so. I think what happened with the coalition is that certain parts of the coalition sort of, didn't exactly fall away, but at least he certainly lost ground with certain elements of the coalition. And then he offset that to some extent, but not enough, by gaining among other groups. And again, this is where we see a surprising thing, which is that, the group in which he had the biggest losses compared to 2016 is white men, who are supposed to be his sort of, really almost symbolic base, like he's the candidate of white men. He lost with white men. He lost to a somewhat smaller degree among white women, and he did, gain. And this is the head scratcher. The one group where he adds the most votes apparently is Hispanics. This is the guy who really launched his candidacy in 2016 by talking about Mexican rapists, and suddenly he is adding all these votes among Hispanics. And I think there have been attempts to analyze that. I think there have been a lot of things. I mean, again, we're sort of speculating about, what would have happened if it hadn't been for the COVID-19 pandemic? Would Trump have won? I don't know. I mean, I think initially, it's kind of interesting to look back that when the pandemic began, a lot of people said that he would win because of it, because there's a tendency to rally around the leader. And of course, in a way, it's kind of the Democrats' luck that he turned out to be so absolutely terrible at it. I mean, if he had positioned himself as, I'm the guy who is going to steer you through this terrible time, he would have done much better. I think a lot of things, once again, we're all sort of playing Monday morning quarterbacks here. But I think the protests against, the anti-racism protests, the sort of the Black Lives Matter protests, that was a kind of complicated factor, because on the one hand, I think it probably had something to do with the drifting away of parts of the white base, especially younger white men, maybe, where there was this perception that, we're having this big moment of contending with, racism and racial injustice, and Trump is sort of on the other side of that. Excuse me. On the other hand, I think there is actually some evidence that among Hispanics, there was a tendency to see the protests as associated with lawlessness, as associated with a rise in crime, as associated with a kind of, chaos and anarchy. And I think, certainly there have been actual interviews with Hispanic voters who said, I saw these people burning cop cars, and I really don't want this happening around here. So that's why I voted for Trump. So I think there's a lot of different elements. And I think I think he lost parts of his base. He gained some other elements. And, I don't know if it's, you can't really say at this point that the Trump coalition doesn't exist anymore, because, there is this large number of people who still believe, or at least tell pollsters that they believe that he really won the election. So, that's, the base is still there.
Okay, that's very interesting, because it actually gets me very neatly onto what I wanted to talk about next, which is, given that the Trump base still exists to some extent, there are enough people willing to believe the things that Donald Trump and people like him say. There's clearly some enduring appeal to Trumpism. As all three of you mentioned at the start, one of the reasons why Donald Trump was so successful was that he appealed to a lot of people who felt left out by the traditional processes of American democracy. What do you think that the mainstream has to say about that? The question I'm asking here is, what did Donald Trump teach us? What can we learn from him? Anyone? Professor Tarcov, Professor Morgan?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to learn, I mean the United States, but I suspect there's lessons for other Western democracies too. We've had it in Britain with Brexit, that there's a disconnect between the establishment and the common folk, for want of a better term. And that is a relatively new phenomenon. You know, if you think about the history of the United States, the history of the United Kingdom, there was a time when government was a good thing. The New Deal, the post-war Attlee government, and the development of the welfare state. But somehow or other, the sense that there's that linkage between government and people has been lost. Partly, I suspect, is because there are no simple, much of the social welfare institutions have been built. Where do we go next? It's a much more complex world that both countries are operating in. There are no simple answers. But I do think that Washington has become separate from the rest of the nation. The sort of elite political culture, and it is seen as such. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the effect of the 2007-9 recession, the loss of wealth, the loss of earnings, and the sense that the establishment, in this case the financial establishment, but also their allies in the political establishment, had let people down. And Donald Trump, in part, was the coming home to roost of the failure of economic leadership back in the Great Recession.
Professor Tarcov? I agree with a lot of that. Yeah, somehow you've got three panelists who agree too much. It must be because we're right.
You could liven it up a little bit. No, throw some rhetorical punches. All right, let's move on. So,
actually, can I sort of add something here? Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that is interesting. I agree with, again, much of what Professor Morgan said, but I think there is an added kind of factor here, which is that the backlash, the sort of populist backlash, is not just against politicians. It's not just against Washington, D.C. It's against the quote unquote coastal elites. It's kind of interesting what a really huge role California plays in the sort of the consciousness of the Trump supporters. As you know, like California is basically what we don't want America to become. It's the sort of, you know, very largely immigrant populated, socially liberal, high taxes, you know, soft on crime. And again, I think the summer protests certainly played a role in this, not just California, but the West Coast in general. There were the sort of ongoing protests in Seattle and in Portland, which is not California, but right next to it. And there really was this perception, which I will say was not entirely baseless, of these, you know, cities becoming completely ungovernable, where, you know, in Seattle, you actually had some sort of loose coalition of, you know, wannabe revolutionaries setting up their own autonomous zone. Which I think initially the city was really kind of, you know, very idealistic about, and that they sort of took the attitude that, oh, well, it's just this, you know, nice hippie camp where people are all, you know, idealistic and affectionate with each other, and then you know, they really pretty much like banished the police from there, and it eventually culminated in 2 people being killed and, you know, several other people being shot. So I think this perception of anarchy, I think, is one thing. It's also a backlash against the those, so-called big tech, the technology companies like Google and Twitter, which really very ostentatiously embrace the sort of new social justice politics, support for Black Lives Matter. There is, so I mean, in a sense, conservatives were really kind of campaigning against these coastal corporations that espouse liberal politics. And again, sort of there definitely is this perception of, oh, well, they despise the common man. There was a lot of talk about conservatives being unfairly banned from YouTube, Twitter, and so on. And I think all of that goes into, mobilizing this Trump coalition. And they don't have the right, I certainly don't think Trumpism offers the right solution, but I think there is a kind of groupthink in, in the sort of online giants. I think there are certain valid points about, the sort of this image of political correctness run amok. There's a definite correlation between, hostility to so-called political correctness and, and support for Trump. And that to some extent did cut across ideological lines. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Go ahead.
I won't disagree, but I'll at least try to add a little.
Finally.
Here. We haven't mentioned what in a way is the second biggest demographic division after race, which is college educated versus non-college educated. This shows up in every poll. It's a division of ideology and politics. It's a division, it's an economic division, it's a cultural division. And that, because we use this word working class, which is a kind of old fashioned word that has lost its, I mean, we all work.
Right.
And I think what we really mean is non-college educated white males, especially. And even his gains among Blacks and Hispanics were amongst males, overwhelmingly too. There's gender, we shouldn't forget that one too. And I think we also tend somewhat to forget it's not just a sort of loss of jobs because of globalization, technology, immigration. It's a destruction of communities, that you have people living in small towns or some urban neighborhoods where their children go to the coasts and leave them. And so you have, what's left are aging and retiring and unemployed people of one generation and whose children have gone to the Bay Area or Boston or Atlanta or Washington, D.C. And I think Trump did appeal to that. The nostalgia is very much for what happened, what those places were like before. And now, and there's the OxyContin epidemics in those places, that communities were destroyed. So that a simple, let's spend some money and raise the level of unemployment doesn't solve the problems of destroyed communities.
I'm going to ask you the awkward follow-up question to that, Professor Tarcov, which is what does? We've concluded that America's sickness, at least in part, is elite failure, lack of faith in government, lack of faith in institutions. How do we solve it? What's the prescription?
I'm not sure I have my prescription pad to take. Remember, I did ask you not to introduce me as Dr. Tarkov, Well, I think, there are some progressive Democrats who are, there was an article in the Washington Post about Ro Khanna's plan to get high tech to invest in those towns and places like Iowa and Kentucky to teach the younger generation coding and create and enable them to work remotely from these towns that they have been abandoning. But on the Republican side, the so-called establishment Republicans, whatever they should be called, are insulting that base rather than offering it concrete solutions. I wish I had them. It seems to me some of the Democrats are thinking more creatively about this because it's a challenge for them too. They can't just go on ignoring that 40% of the country and writing it. You look at the map, and geographically, just looking at the map, it's 90% red. It's just these little blue dots on the coasts, and here in Chicago too. The Democrats have their own problems. I wish we had, since this is a questioning extremism, I will confess I'm not a conservative, I'm a moderate, and I would like to see two moderate parties, a moderate liberal party and a moderate conservative party, and I'm afraid we won't have either.
Well, Professor Morgan, you have historical experience in this area. But it's been the case before that the parties have been deeply divided. In 1968, among others, where there were riots, street violence, people being murdered in the streets. And in the 1970s, more people were killed by bombs in the streets of America than are killed in Afghanistan today. So America used to be a pretty dangerous place, but then it got safe again. Why do you think that was? What do you think mainstream liberals and conservatives did then and can do now to rebuild institutions?
Well, in a sense, you go back to the 1960s, and there was a belief that the Great Society program of Lyndon B. Johnson went too far, a belief on the part of the party's traditional supporters. And what happened, I think, in the 1970s, coming to Professor Tarkov's point, is that both parties changed. The Republicans became more conservative in the 1970s, and the Democrats kind of developed a liberalism which was qualitatively different to the liberalism of the Great Society. But I don't think either party went to the polls in the sense that, if we think of Ronald Reagan as the most conservative president since Herbert Hoover, Ronald Reagan wouldn't recognize the Republican Party today. He was a pragmatic conservative rather than a hardcore ideological conservative. When you think in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter was hardly a traditional conservative. He tried to rebuild the party's appeal in the South. It didn't work for a whole set of reasons beyond its control, maybe to do with the economy. But, if I were a Democrat today, I would see some grounds for hope. This is not a mainstream view, I might add, it's my own. Look, Joe Biden takes office in the most difficult circumstances of any president in peacetime since Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. Roosevelt at least had a united country behind him to launch the New Deal. Biden does not have a united country and doesn't have the kind of control of the Congress that Roosevelt had in the 1930s. But Biden has an opportunity. The United States is suffering from this pandemic. Its economy is going into seriously towards recession. It's not in recession just yet. But if Biden can turn things around, roll out the vaccine program, get people back to work, get the economy going again, those are tangible benefits. They're not necessarily part of an ideological program, but they are what government does. Government solves problems. And if Biden shows that government can do that, federal government can do that, I think he's in with a shout. But it's a big if. And of course, I think we've got to keep in mind that Biden is not seen as legitimate by something like 2/5 of the American electorate. That is a serious problem.
Before I ask, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that very shortly we'll be in conversation. So you'll be able to ask your questions and answers. So get them ready in your heads now. And in about 10 minutes, you can start sticking your hands up using Zoom's function. And then you too can have the chance to ask these very smart people some questions. All right. So given this, then, that there is a prescription for hope in the future on the left, if the left can show that government can solve problems, what do you think the right has to do? Given that we are probably certain at this point that Donald Trump will not be convicted, even though he has been impeached for a second time, what do you think the task of moderate Republicans is now? Cathy?
Oh my goodness. Well, yeah, I agree that he will not be convicted. I don't think, I think the jury is still out at this point, not on the conviction in the impeachment trial, but on whether Donald Trump will remain a viable presence in the Republican Party. And I think in a sense, once we move past the impeachment where, you know, the base has a reason to kind of rally around him, I think it's very much an open question whether he'll be able to maintain a sort of leadership position or, you know, eventually fade away. I mean, look, to a large extent, I think he already from this sort of prime spot in the nation's consciousness. Because, you know, one thing that was definitely the case when he was president is that he was kind of everywhere. He was sort of dominating the entire space of political discourse and, you know, sucking up all the oxygen, so to speak. And I think that is something that we're not really seeing anymore. You know, partly, you know, the fact that he was booted from Twitter, I think kind of added to this in a really interesting way. But, you know, I think if he wanted to, he could certainly find, you know, he is in a position to create a platform for himself if he wanted to. It's kind of interesting that he is really not in a hurry, apparently, to get back to, you know, online spaces. So I don't know I mean, it's difficult to answer this question because we don't really know to what extent, you know, Trump will remain a dominant presence. I think certainly the moderate conservatives need to start making their case. You know, I do want to pull back a little bit since we are talking about extremism. I do want to say that, you know, the Democrats really need to be careful not to go down the path of, you know, what is perceived by a large percentage of the population as progressive extremism. You know, we saw a controversy just the other day that's actually still kind of ongoing about the school board in San Francisco deciding to rename, you know, a bunch of schools that are named after people who are perceived as, you know, no longer acceptable because, you know, they're racist, they're, you know, they're oppressors. And among them is Abraham Lincoln. You know, we're seeing this, we're seeing this, sorry about that. There really is a sort of extremist progressive ideology where everything that is not perfect in America's past is to be condemned as racist, sexist, imperialistic, and whatnot. And I think it is very kind of deeply alienating to the average American when suddenly, and you know, in a funny way, it really does kind of validate people like Trump, because you know, a few years ago when they started talking about taking down the Confederate monuments, there was Trump saying, well, you know, you start with this, and then you're going to get to the point where they'll come for, you know, Washington and Jefferson and then Lincoln. And, you know, what do you know? We're actually seeing this this push today to say, well, you know, everything in America's past that was associated with, you know, various forms of racial and gender oppression really has to go, because we can't celebrate somebody who wasn't, you know, up to the progressive moral standards of today. Well, you know, that's ridiculous. And it's ridiculous in any culture, really. And it's certainly ridiculous in America. So I think that kind of And, you know, we're seeing stories about, you know, diversity training courses in which, you know, people are told that, well, if you're white, you have to confess to your complicity in racism, and you have to, you know, count how many books on your bookshelf are by white authors, and, you know, if there are too many books out there that, you know, that are white, you really have to do something about it. You know, how many non-white characters are in your favorite show. And like you have to start, you know, questioning yourself at every turn in your life. And I think that is very, very deeply alienating to many people. And, you know, and I think this is where, and a lot of that, by the way, is non-political. I mean, certainly a lot of this is not coming down from the Democratic Party. But I think there is a large segment of the Democratic Party that I think is kind of enthralled to, you know, what is popularly known as identity politics. And I think that is a path that is really not, you know, getting us anywhere positive. It's getting us to more polarization. And certainly that's not to say that we you know, we shouldn't be paying attention to, you know, issues that have to do with race, gender, etc. It's more, you know, how you go about it. It's more, you know, are you going about it in a way that sort of tells, you know, white males that, well, you know, you're the bad guy because you're the white male. And there have been some statements that have been made, you know, by certain, you know, by fairly prominent people in the Democratic Party. Like, you know, there was a comment a couple of years ago by Senator Marie Hirano, who, you know, in some controversy basically said, well, you know, I just want to tell the white males, you know, you really need to like shut up, sit down and listen. You know, that's not a great message, and that's really not a great path to elections. So, you know, that's so yeah, I just want to say, you know, I think if we're talking about extremism, I think it is important for the Democrats to kind of do some soul searching of their own and stay away from that. And I think, you know, that's.
So elites of both parties have roles to play in controlling their extremist fringes. I would love very much to ask all three of you more questions, but unfortunately I can't hog you all to myself. Irritatingly, the responsibilities of my position as moderator mean I have to let other people talk. It's very disappointing. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, please click the little raise hand button that should be on the bottom of your screen for Zoom. And Raphael, I think you have a question. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to unmute you now and you can ask your question. Oh, okay. He lowered his hand very quickly. Probably means he doesn't want to talk. So Freddie, if you have a question, I'll just unmute you now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, sorry, yeah, I'm also Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism, not to be confused. I'm the president. Great job, Alex, and it's been a fantastic talk. Panelists, thank you so much for coming on. My question is, who do you see leading the Republican Party forward in 4 years' time at the next election?
I think this is for Professor Tarkov.
I'll give you a simple answer. All right, we agree Trump will be acquitted in the Senate. Trump will say he was exonerated thereby. Trump will decide that the best way to raise money and hold rallies is to announce he's running for president. It'll be a very brave Republican who would even run against him. He will get the Republican nomination. What happens after that, I won't even dare to predict, but I think at this point, we're in for at least another 4 years of a Trump-dominated and led Republican Party. Again, strange things happened in the past 6 years that I and many other people never predicted. And something could happen. Something could happen to him personally. Something could happen to the country generally that destroys that scenario. But that seems to me the most likely scenario at this point. And the Democrats, first I thought it was really stupid of them to impeach him because he would be acquitted and claim he was exonerated. But it was very clever. They forced the Republicans in the House and the Senate to either vote to acquit him or or impeach him in the House, convict him in the Senate. The ones who voted to impeach him or who will vote to convict him will face tough primary opponents. And the others will, the ones who voted to acquit him, will face tough Democratic critics. The Democrats have, in a way, almost forced the Republican Party to choose Trump again.
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot depends on, well, first of all, I mean, I do think he'll be acquitted, but I think we need to wait and see what kind of things will come out during the trial. I think it's possible that, you know, while he will be acquitted, you know, I don't want to say that, you know, his image will be tarnished because his image has been tarnished. I mean, it's almost kind of, I mean, it is, I mean, in a way, it is this very, very bizarre phenomenon where it's like, you know, Trump keeps doing things where everybody goes like, well, this is really the end of him. And of course, you know, it's not. So I definitely don't want to go that route. But, you know, we do live in unpredictable times. I think that the fact that Trump lost, and I think, you know, I do want to say, you know, in terms of all the people saying that, you know, oh, I believe that, you know, Trump really won the election. It's kind of, it's hard for me to say to what extent they really believe that and to what extent it's something that they're saying because it's part of their sort of tribal identity. Like if you're a loyal, for a lot of people, I think right now, if you're a loyal Republican, that means you have to say you believe that, you know, Joe Biden didn't really win the election. I do think that in terms of, you know, Trump's image among his base, I think a lot of them really do kind of know that he lost. And because the one thing that he really hates most is being a loser. I mean, you know, that's sort of Trump's favorite epithet, you know, loser. And of course, that's what he is now. And I think even many of his followers, no matter what they may tell pollsters, really kind of know deep down that he's a loser. You know, I think it does, you know, puncture his aura, because he did kind of have developed this aura of invincibility, you know, during the 2016 election. And then, of course, when he won in the general election, when everybody, you know, all the pundits were pretty much, you know, predicting that he was going to lose. And then he won, and he really did develop this aura of being unbeatable. That's certainly not what he is now. And I think, you know, to nominate him again, I mean, I think that people who, you know, the pundits, the moderate pundits, the moderate Republican politicians and activists who say, like, wait a minute, you know, you nominate Trump and you're going to get clobbered. I think right now they have a pretty good case. They have a pretty solid case. So I don't know what's going to happen. It depends on the Democrats. It depends on whether the Democrats are able to stay a kind of moderate course. It's
the future of American elections.
We don't really know.
Yeah. Georgia, I'm gonna unmute you now. If you want to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
So my question is, as you pointed out earlier, Trumpism seems to be a movement of the ordinary people against the elites. So considering that he's a highly privileged businessman, that was his background before, why do you think that so many people took him seriously as someone that could represent the working class?
Professor Morgan, Ronald Reagan was an actor. Why do you think he was able to carry the working class with him?
Well, Ronald Reagan came along at the right time. The United States was reeling from failure in Vietnam. Its economy had hit the skids, and Reagan offered his own brand of Make America Great Again. In fact, Trump stole Make America Great from Reagan's own, one of Reagan's own election slogans in 1980. But you know, it's a message. The confluence that brought us Trump was polarization, Trump's realization that he could get around the mainstream media through Twitter, and the fact that, you know, we have to keep this in mind. Richard Nixon was the greatest liar in the White House until Donald Trump came along, and suddenly Richard Nixon looked like the beacon of truth. How many misstatements, falsehoods, and lies did Trump tell? And no one could catch him out. It was the old thing, you know, tell a lie as they check in that one, tell more lies. And I think that gave Trump an edge. I think that he was so different from the kind of mainstream politician that Republicans were used to and Democrats, that he got away with a lot. And the next time round, I think Professor Tarcov is absolutely right, that if Trump does go for the presidential nomination in 2024, he will get it because the Republicans, among other things, will fear that better to have him inside the tent than outside the tent, possibly running as a third party candidate. All of these things will come into play. It would be an amazing comment on the nature of American politics if we have an 82-year-old Democrat running against a 79-year-old Republican. I'm allowed to be ageist, and I'm an old guy myself. Okay.
Right. Unfortunately, everyone, that's all the time we have for today. Actually, we've got one more question, but please answer it quickly. We literally have 2 minutes. Rose, go ahead. You're inaudible.
The mic is off.
She's muted.
All right.
Well, I guess that doesn't work.
I'm really sorry. Unfortunately, that means we're out of time for today's session. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for coming along today, to Professors Morgan and Tarcov and to Cathy. Thank you so much for donating your time. To everyone who came along, thank you so much. If you're interested in future Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism events, on the 18th from 7 to 8 p.m, we're going to be hosting an event on social media's fragmented reality, the rise of online extremism, where we'll be talking about all sorts of clever things with all sorts of clever people. In the meantime, thank you so much once more to our panelists for coming. Thank you for all of us for coming. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.